You ever sit at a table where everyone thinks they've got you figured out until one phone call rewrites the entire script? That night, they thought they were cutting off the family failure. They didn't realize they were silencing the very person who would soon outrank them all. I didn't plan for my moment to come with dessert. But fate has a funny sense of timing. Stay with me because what happened next made the silence in that room unforgettable. My name is Cara Mitchell, and I was never supposed to be the success story. At least, not by my family's standards. In Boston's wealthiest circles, legacy is everything, and my father built ours with Wall Street grit and social posturing. The Mitchells were tradition like armor Harvard degrees, curated relationships, and a disdain for anything outside the mold. I was the middle child who rewrote that script with lines they refused to read. From the manicured colonial estate in Brookline to private schools that bred legacy over individuality, I was immersed in a world that praised conformity. My older brother, James, was the golden boy with the Harvard MBA. My younger sister, Madison, was the polished socialite destined for political greatness. I, however, was the anomaly, the one who chose coding over cotillions and ideas over inheritance. From the moment I could build my own websites, I began building a life they would never understand. At 12, while they were polishing family silver, I was debugging JavaScript errors. While James practiced speeches for mock boardrooms and Madison trained for debate, I obsessed over efficiency algorithms and digital frameworks. My room became a sanctuary of blinking code and glowing ambition, but at every turn, my curiosity was dismissed as a phase or worse, a flaw. Not very Mitchell, they'd whisper. I started to wonder if Mitchell was a name I'd ever want to live up to. My parents didn't just fail to support my passions, they actively buried them under layers of ridicule. When I got into MIT, they called it a phase. When I aced every class, they called it a distraction. When I graduated with honors, they were in Martha's Vineyard celebrating Madison's engagement. I didn't cry. I took that silence and coded it into fuel. That was the moment I realized I didn't need applause, I needed results. By the way, if you're already feeling the weight of expectations and carving your own path too, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Stories like mine aren't rare, they're just rarely told. And you won't want to miss what happens when the tables finally turn. In the Mitchell house, life wasn't lived, it was orchestrated. Dinners had seating charts, conversations had scripts, and futures had blueprints drawn in permanent ink. From a young age, I understood that dreams didn't matter unless they aligned with the Mitchell brand. James' internship at Goldman Sachs was discussed like royal succession. Madison's law school acceptance warranted a press announcement. My robotics championship? Not even a voicemail. Everything I did was filtered through the lens of what it wasn't. It wasn't corporate. It wasn't social. It wasn't Mitchell. My father once told me that engineers are the ones who build things, but real wealth comes from owning what others build. That line stuck with me not because I believed it, but because I wanted to prove the reverse was true. I didn't need to own others' labor. I just needed to believe in my own. Dinner conversations were masterclasses in subtle dismissal. When I mentioned a new project, my mother changed the subject to Madison's dress fittings. When I shared a job promotion, my father asked if I was still just coding. They smiled like I was a child playing make-believe, and I learned to smile back like it didn't hurt. But behind every dismissal, I filed away fuel for the day they would finally see me. While they floated on family money, I worked part-time through school and took out loans they could have paid with one check. I wasn't punished for choosing independence, I was prepared by it. Every job, every coding session, every sleepless night gave me something more valuable than legacy, resilience. I didn't need a name. I was building a brand. Even now, I sometimes wonder if their rejection was a curse or a gift. But one thing I never questioned: the discipline it taught me. When you're not handed a seat at the table, you learn how to build your own one line of code, one pitch, one sleepless night at a time. The idea for Secure Health wasn't born in a boardroom, it was born in frustration. I watched as patients waited months for appointments while specialists sat idle due to scheduling inefficiencies. No one seemed to care that the system was broken, but I did. I knew I could fix it not with talk, but with tech. While my family laughed over champagne, I mapped a solution in silence. I spent my nights building wireframes and my weekends pitching skeptical investors. Most saw a young woman without pedigree, but Jessica Barnes saw potential. That $200,000 seed funding didn't just launch a company, it launched my second life. I moved out of theory and into execution. With every bug I fixed, every hospital I onboarded, I felt closer to the proof I craved. Alicia joined me as an admin, but within months, she was my second in command. She believed in the vision with the same fire I had. While the Mitchells hosted galas, we coded in heatwave conditions with frozen peas taped to our necks. Our office was a broom closet with Wi-Fi, but it was ours. Every late night wasn't just sacrifice, it was a quiet revolution. Our first big break came with Massachusetts General Hospital. When we showed them the pilot results, reduced wait times, higher satisfaction, they signed on without hesitation. For the first time, I had institutional validation that didn't come from a family name. It came from metrics, from impact, from something real. I never told my family, not because I wanted to surprise them, but because I was protecting what I'd built. Their skepticism wasn't fuel anymore. It was noise. I chose to move in silence, knowing that one day, if the moment ever came, the numbers would speak louder than any dinner toast. The more secure health grew, the quieter I became at family gatherings. I perfected the art of the vague update, same job, different projects, while hiding the fact that our company was expanding faster than I'd ever imagined. My life split in two. In one world, I was a CEO in sneakers leading national hospital contracts. In the other, I was still just Cara, tolerated between martinis and monologues. I drove my old Civic to dinners, leaving my Tesla in the garage. I wore Banana Republic instead of the designer labels I could now afford. I nodded politely when James bragged about his team, and I smiled blankly when Madison name-dropped political donors. I was no longer angry, I was strategic. The less they knew, the less they could diminish. It wasn't just pride, it was protection. I'd poured everything into secure health, and I couldn't stomach the idea of my parents belittling something that mattered so deeply. Success had become sacred. If they couldn't recognize my work without a Forbes article or a trust fund tag, then they didn't deserve access to it. I kept building in the dark, waiting for the right light to break through. And still, part of me hoped they might really see what I had created. Not just the valuation or the press coverage, but the impact, the difference we were making in patients' lives. But that kind of recognition required empathy, not just optics. And that was a currency my family rarely dealt in. They praised what glittered, not what grew. So I remained the family outlier by design. I wasn't hiding failure, I was hiding power. The kind of power they'd never imagined could come from the daughter they once dismissed as an eccentric coder. But that power was growing, and sooner or later, it would no longer fit behind a polite smile and a modest dress. By the time we began IPO talks, Secure Health was no longer a hopeful startup, it was a force. We had over 100 employees, national reach, and Goldman Sachs managing our offering. The irony? My father had spent 30 years at Goldman and still had no idea his daughter was their newest star client. That silence wasn't an accident. It was earned. Every call with Goldman felt surreal. Their analysts treated me with deference. Their underwriters sought my opinion. For a girl once mocked for staying up late coding, these meetings felt like small victories stitched into a much larger win. The numbers kept climbing. So did the press interest. I kept dodging it, unwilling to tip off the family until the timing was right. Our valuation hit $100 million. The SoftBank deal neared. Internally, we popped champagne. Externally, I sipped wine at family dinners and answered the same tired questions, still doing tech stuff. I began to realize that the more I succeeded, the more absurd their ignorance became. It wasn't just obliviousness. It was willful dismissal. I didn't hate them for it anymore. I just didn't need them to understand. What I needed was clarity for myself. When your work starts to matter more than your need for validation, that's when you've truly stepped into your own story. And I was there, quietly, solidly, completely there. But I knew the mask couldn't stay on forever. The IPO was coming, so was the reckoning. I hadn't planned a dramatic reveal. I wasn't seeking revenge or applause. I simply wanted the truth to stand on its own, unpolished, undeniable, and powerful. They had chosen not to look, but soon, they wouldn't be able to look away. The invitation to the annual family dinner arrived like clockwork, a stiff email from my mother followed by a handwritten card from Margot, the longtime housekeeper who was always kinder to me than anyone else in that home. "We hope you'll attend," it read, with just enough passive-aggressive guilt to remind me of my place. I arved yes, but on my terms. That night, Alicia and I stayed up until a.m. reviewing final investor documents. We celebrated SoftBank's interest with takeout sushi and a shared bottle of champagne in our office. I told her about the dinner, and she raised one eyebrow. "You going to tell them?" she asked. I shrugged. I still didn't know, but something told me this might be the moment. I chose my outfit carefully. A sleek, simple black dress, not designer, not flashy, but sharp enough to feel like armor. I left the Tesla at home and took the Civic. As I pulled up to the family estate, memories swirled, science fairs unattended, graduations ignored, dreams dismissed. But this time, I didn't feel small. I felt composed. Inside, everything was as curated as ever. James with his smug grin, Madison holding court in pearls, my mother arranging canapes like precision art, my father swirling scotch, already measuring the worth of every guest in the room. They hadn't changed, but I had. I'd brought more to that table than they could possibly imagine. And deep down, I knew, no matter what happened that night, I didn't need anything from them. Not a check, not approval, not a single nod of recognition. I had built something they couldn't dismiss, even if they tried. The reckoning wasn't about drama, it was about truth, and truth was already walking in the door behind me. The estate hadn't changed. Imposing white columns, polished wood floors, the faint scent of lavender polish and old money. I walked in like a guest, not a daughter, greeted by Margot's warm smile. Her embrace was the only real welcome I'd receive all night. In the solarium, laughter flowed like expensive wine, with James' mid-anecdote and Madison's voice piercing through about seating charts and senators. I knew this rhythm well, the family orchestra where every note reinforced the hierarchy, and I was always the missing chord. My mother air-kissed my cheek, noting my punctuality with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. My father raised his scotch with the usual fox warmth, asking if I was still at that little tech gig. James launched into a monologue about his promotion, detailing corner offices and harbor views. Madison glanced over with that patented smirk, complimenting my comfortable outfit. The digs were subtle, practiced, each line designed to remind me I didn't belong. Only Aunt Patricia offered something real, a hug and a whisper. Ignore them all. I smiled at her gratefully, grounding myself in the only presence at that table who ever saw me for who I really was. The rest of the pre-dinner ritual was performance art. Assigned seating, vintage wine poured like holy water, compliments swapped like stock tips. I played my role, quiet and composed. But I wasn't the same Cara they remembered. This time, I wasn't hiding. I was simply waiting. As dinner was announced and we moved into the grand dining room with its ancestral portraits and impossible expectations, I took my seat beside Patricia. My hands were steady, my mind clear. They didn't know it yet, but they were sitting across from someone who had built an empire in silence, a truth that would no longer stay quiet. The room glowed with gold light and pretension. The table was set with bone china and crystal, as if we were preparing to dine with royalty. But what lay ahead was far less elegant. Tonight would be the last time I would be treated like a guest in my own family. Because tonight, the truth wouldn't knock, it would walk straight through the door and take a seat at the head of the table. As Margot cleared the plates from the main course, my father tapped his glass with a fork. It was the signal we all knew well. Time for announcements, decisions, declarations. Your mother and I have been revisiting the family's estate plan, he began, voice firm but calm, as if discussing a quarterly earnings call. My mother nodded solemnly. With Madison's wedding and James's promotion, it feels appropriate to align resources. James beamed under the spotlight. Madison preened. The air was thick with expectation. Then came the hammer drop. Which brings us to you, Cara, my father said, his tone shifting to something colder. We've decided to reallocate your share of family support. My mother followed up like a closing bell. Effective immediately, we're cutting you off financially, as if I were some college kid who'd gone too far off script. I didn't flinch. Their money hadn't touched my life in years, but the gesture still stung. Not because of the loss, but because of the message. They weren't just cutting me off. They were cutting me out. Until you demonstrate more appropriate choices, my father added, like a manager reprimanding a poor-performing intern. The room stayed quiet, except for the sound of crystal being adjusted nervously. My siblings watched with smug concern. James nodded like it made perfect sense. Madison offered her usual half-sweet, half-stabbing remark. It's just because they care, Cara. You're so free-spirited. The implication was clear. I was the problem. I was the one not measuring up. They were trying to correct me, not realizing I'd already outgrown their entire rubric for success. I sat straighter, the air colder now, my heart quieter. What struck me wasn't the cruelty, it was the detachment. They had no idea who I was. They hadn't cared enough to ask. This decision was based on the caricature they'd built of me years ago, and as they poured more wine and moved on to wedding updates, they had no idea that the next course would come with a far less digestible truth. My phone buzzed once in my bag. I ignored it, then again twice, 3 times, a familiar rhythm. Alicia's emergency signal. I excused myself, my father rolling his eyes at the breach of etiquette. Just a little tech fire, he quipped. I stood calmly, excused myself, and answered. Alicia's voice was clear, trembling with excitement. SoftBank confirmed. 40 million. We just hit 100 million valuation. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I looked up and remembered exactly where I stood. I turned slowly back to the table. Phone still pressed to my ear. That's incredible, I said, loud enough for them to hear. Alicia continued, unaware of the audience. Media outlets wanted interviews. Goldman had popped champagne. Forbes was scheduling a feature. The room fell silent. Even the silverware froze mid-air. I hung up, returned to my seat, and met each face across the table. Madison's mouth hung open. James blinked like he'd misheard. My mother's wine glass hovered mid-air. My father stared at me like a client who'd just outmaneuvered him in a deal. Then, breaking the silence, Aunt Patricia raised her glass with a grin. Well, she said, I believe congratulations are in order. The next few moments were a blur of confusion, recalibration, and backpedaling. My mother's voice softened to honey. Why didn't you tell us? My father's brow furrowed with new respect. Goldman's running your IPO? James stammered out something about partnerships. Madison blinked faster than she spoke, searching for a narrative she could co-opt. But it was too late. The truth had already changed the temperature in the room. No one knew what to say next, but I did. I sat still, composed, and let the silence hang like judgment, because in that silence, they were finally seeing me. Not as a rebel or a disappointment, but as something they couldn't control, couldn't dismiss, and couldn't quite comprehend. And I wasn't done yet. They tried to recover quickly. My father asked carefully, Secure Health, you built that? I nodded. From scratch. James looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Goldman's underwriting your IPO? Marcus Steinberg's team, I replied. The name alone was enough to make my father sit back, recalculating everything. He doesn't take small clients, he muttered. My mother leaned in, attempting warmth. Cara, darling, this is all so wonderful. We must celebrate properly. I'll call the club tomorrow, private room, special menu. It was surreal watching them pivot, scrambling to rewrite the script. Suddenly, I wasn't the problem child, I was the asset. My success had given them amnesia. Madison chimed in, her voice dripping with strategic cheer. This is huge, Cara. With Brian's political career and your tech background, we could really collaborate. It wasn't support, it was an attempt to merge brands. My father spoke next, tone suddenly collaborative. We should explore family investment options. Pre-IPO access could be beneficial. I let them speak. Let them spin their new narrative. Then I stopped them cold. There won't be any family investment. Our cap table is closed. My mother blinked. But surely we can work something out. You made your position clear earlier, I said. And I've made mine now. Secure Health doesn't need the Mitchell name. The table went quiet again. This time with the weight of rejection. Except now, I was the one doing the rejecting. I had waited years for this moment, not to humiliate them but to reclaim my power. I wasn't the misfit anymore. I was the storm they hadn't seen coming. Madison, ever the tactician, leaned forward. Cara, be reasonable. You can't just shut your family out of something so important. I smiled thinly. You've done exactly that for years. My father cleared his throat, voice rehearsed. Let's not dwell on the past. What matters now is moving forward together. They were trying to secure proximity to power, but I'd seen too much, endured too much, to fall for performance. You never supported me, I said calmly. You tolerated me. My mother objected. We've always believed in your independence. I shook my head. You've mistaken indifference for support. James leaned in with fox sincerity. Come on, sis. We were just concerned. You never told us any of this. Because you never asked, I replied. Because I knew you wouldn't listen. Their offers came now not from care but calculation. They were adjusting their stance only because my bank account demanded it. Even the flowers, the invitations, the promises of connection were currency bargaining chips for access. But my company had been built without them, without their blessing. The only reason I'm valuable to you now, I said, is because you know I'm worth more than all of you combined. The silence confirmed it. For years, I'd tried to prove my worth to people who wouldn't recognize it unless it had a valuation attached. And now that I had one, they were ready to rewrite history. But I wasn't. I didn't need to be part of their narrative anymore. I was writing my own. I stood to leave, not out of anger, but clarity. Thank you for dinner, I said. But I have a team meeting tomorrow morning. Real work, the kind you dismissed as a hobby. My mother looked stricken. Don't go. We need to plan a proper celebration. For the family. I raised an eyebrow. I built this without you. My father rose as well, extending a hand. You've made us proud. Let's not let a misunderstanding damage the family bond. I looked at him, seeing not a father but a businessman negotiating from a weaker position. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's clarity. You finally saw what I am because now you think you can profit from it. I turned to Aunt Patricia. Ready to go? She smiled and gathered her things. Madison made one last attempt. We're hosting a dinner for Brian's supporters next week. You'd be the perfect keynote speaker. I paused at the doorway. I'll check my schedule, I said. But just so you know, my speaking fee starts at $50,000. As we stepped out into the crisp evening air, I exhaled for the first time in hours. You handled that with grace, Patricia said. Grace and fire. I laughed softly. It wasn't just for me. It was for every girl told she wasn't enough until she was too much. That night, I drove back to my loft in South Boston. No more hiding. No more waiting for them to catch up. I was done seeking permission to exist. My life wasn't about the Mitchell legacy, it was about the one I was creating. The next chapter wouldn't be written at that table, under chandeliers and judgment. It would be written in code, in courage, and in conviction. I didn't start with investors or headlines. I started with an idea born in frustration and empathy, watching patients wait months for care they needed yesterday. In my tiny Somerville apartment, with barely enough space for a desk, I coded through the night. I had nothing but determination, caffeine, and a clear vision. No trust fund, no mentors, just instinct and resolve. The healthcare system was drowning in inefficiencies. Patients suffered while hospitals clung to outdated workflows. I thought, there has to be a better way. So, I built it. Secure Health wasn't flashy in its first version, but it worked. It connected the dots. A HIPAA-compliant platform that merged AI with patient data to match people to the right specialists. Every dollar mattered. I spent months living off ramen and instant coffee, pouring my savings into developing a prototype. When the ARC broke during a heat wave, we worked in our underwear, cooling off with bags of frozen peas. It was ridiculous, raw and exhilarating. We were building something real, something that mattered. Finding funding was a battlefield. Male investors asked if I had a technical co-founder translation, a man. Others suggested I take a supporting role until someone more seasoned could lead. They didn't see a founder. They saw a girl who got lucky. But I didn't need their permission to keep building. I needed just one yes. That yes came from Jessica Barnes, an angel investor who didn't flinch. She'd run a hospital network. She understood the problem. She saw me. Her $200,000 check didn't just fund code, it funded belief. I quit my job, hired 3 people, and got to work. That was the beginning of Secure Health's real heartbeat. If you're enjoying this journey so far, hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us keep telling stories of people who build despite the odds. We didn't have an office. We had a converted storage room with water stains on the ceiling and no heating. The chairs didn't match. The Wi-Fi barely worked. But every single one of us believed in what we were building. We worked until a.m. and still laughed over pizza boxes. Purpose gives you energy that sleep never could. Alicia Thompson came in as an admin but quickly became my right hand. She understood healthcare systems better than anyone I'd interviewed. She could translate bureaucratic chaos into actionable fixes. Within months, she was effectively our crew, even if her title still said assistant. Titles didn't matter in those days. Only impact did. Massachusetts General Hospital was our breakthrough. They piloted Secure Health in their neurology department. Skeptical at first. Within 6 weeks, patient satisfaction jumped 42%. Specialist utilization soared. Wait times dropped like stones. We had something hospitals hadn't seen before: results, tangible ones, numbers that made administrators pay attention. With real data in hand, everything changed. We weren't pitching dreams anymore, we were presenting proof. Other hospitals signed on. Revenues started coming in. We finally moved into a proper office in Kendall Square. There were windows, desks, a coffee machine that didn't explode. It felt like arriving, but only just. The next rounds of funding came faster. Series A, $4.5 million. Series B, $28 million. Our valuation hit $65 million. But I kept quiet. My family still thought I was toiling away at a startup they couldn't remember the name of. And that was fine by me for now. Success wasn't ready to be shared. Not yet. I deliberately played small in front of them, dressed down for dinners, parked my Tesla blocks away and walked in late. Let them believe I still lived in a cramped studio instead of a South Boston loft I owned outright. It wasn't pettiness. It was protection. I needed to see who they were without the distortion of my worth. There's a strange kind of freedom in being underestimated. No one expects anything of you. You're invisible, so you get to move without interference. While they debated politics and hedge funds over cocktails, I was revolutionizing access to healthcare from a co-working closet. Their laughter was my lullaby, their ignorance, my shield. By the time Forbes called, we had over 100 employees, contracts with more than 2,000 hospitals. Our IPO was being led ironically by Goldman Sachs. I smiled when I heard the name, the same firm my father built his career in. Now, they were helping launch my legacy. The symmetry was poetic, but I kept the mask on. I needed the reveal to be clean. The satisfaction wouldn't come from bragging, it would come from being undeniable. When people ignore you because they think you're insignificant, the best revenge isn't confrontation, it's elevation. Let them miss it all, then let them feel it all at once. In the weeks before the dinner, things were moving fast. SoftBank was circling, media was calling, but I didn't flinch. I knew who I was. The girl who fixed computers in her bedroom was now negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. I didn't need anyone to clap. I'd already built my own stage. I chose my outfit carefully that night. Not the Chanel I could afford, but a black Banana Republic dress that said modest, not millionaire. I wasn't hiding because I was ashamed, I was hiding because I needed to witness one last time who they truly were when they thought I was no one. That dinner wasn't just tradition anymore. It was a test. The Mitchell estate hadn't changed. It was still grand, curated, dripping with old money and outdated pride. I parked behind James' Porsche and Madison's Range Rover, stepped out in my well-worn flats, and walked in carrying a $30 bottle of wine. Not the Dom I had waiting at home. I brought what they expected, played the part they'd written for me. Inside, the performance began immediately. James was bragging about his promotion. Madison was curating her wedding updates like press releases. My father sipped his scotch. My mother arranged canapés, and not one of them asked about me with real interest. I knew every line in the script. I'd lived it too many times. Only Aunt Patricia saw through it. Her hug was genuine, her warmth uncalculated. She didn't ask about promotions or properties, she asked if I was okay. That question almost undid me, but I smiled and told her I was managing. The truth was, I wasn't just managing, I was preparing to detonate their illusion of me. Dinner began, and so did the ritual, the updates, the scoring, the condescension. James was the rising star, Madison, the future politician's wife. And I was still the enigma, the tolerated anomaly, until I wasn't. Until one phone call would shift the power in the room so completely, they'd forget how to breathe. The table grew quiet as my father cleared his throat, the family's signal for a serious announcement. The room stiffened in unison, like actors hitting their marks. Your mother and I have decided, he began, to cut you off completely. His voice didn't crack. His words were polished, rehearsed, final. I didn't flinch. It was theatrical in its cruelty. They waited until the moment when everyone's glass was full, plates half empty, tension high. My mother delivered the second blow, her tone even colder, effective immediately. No allowance, no access, no inheritance, not even the vacation house. I was no longer one of them. At least, not on paper. It wasn't about money. It hadn't been in years. It was about judgment. They saw my career as a phase, a rebellion, a childish whim they were done tolerating. Appropriate Mitchell choices, they said, which really meant choices they approved of. choices that mirrored their own. My silence threatened that mirror, so they shattered it. I asked them what they expected me to do. Quit? Apologize? Reapply for the family's affection? Their answers were wrapped in concern, but the message was clear: become one of us or remain discarded. Madison smiled faintly. James looked satisfied. They thought they'd won. They thought I'd crumble, but they had no idea what I was holding. Alicia's call came right on cue. My phone vibrated once, twice, then again and again. Her emergency signal. My hand went to my purse as the air in the room shifted. Aunt Patricia whispered, "It sounds urgent." It was, just not in the way they imagined. Because sometimes, karma doesn't wait for dessert. I answered calmly, standing at the edge of the room. Alicia's voice rang clear and loud enough for everyone to hear. SoftBank is in. $40 million confirmed. We're officially at $100 million pre-IPO. Time stopped. Forks froze midair. Glasses hovered. My family's expressions morphed in slow motion. Confusion, disbelief, fear. I nodded through the call, asked smart follow-ups, and ended with, "Thank you, Alicia. Let's meet at 8 tomorrow." Then I turned back to the table where my invisibility had just burned away. Aunt Patricia clapped softly. Madison's mouth hung open. My mother blinked like she'd just been slapped. And my father? Calculating. Always calculating. They tried to recover. My mother offered a stunned, "Darling, why didn't you tell us?" My father asked, "Goldman is leading?" James tried to mask his panic with curiosity. But I didn't hand them a lifeline. I didn't rush to soothe their bruised egos. I just said, "Secure health." "Yes, we're working with Marcus Steinberg." Silence again. They scrambled to reframe it. Madison suggested campaign synergies. My father pitched family investments. James offered board presence. It was almost funny. 10 minutes ago, I was the family disappointment. Now I was a missed opportunity. They wanted to claim my success. I let them twist. Then I said no to the board seats, no to the trust fund reinstatement, no to the sudden enthusiasm disguised as support. You didn't want me when I was small. You don't get to have me now that I'm big. Their silence this time, it wasn't from disbelief. It was from realizing they'd underestimated me for the last time. The aftermath of that call was like emotional whiplash. They sat frozen, scrambling silently to recalculate my worth. For years, they believed they knew who I was. And now, in under 60 seconds, that illusion had disintegrated. My success wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was quantifiable, undeniable, uncomfortably real. My father's voice was the first to recover, colored by something between awe and opportunism. "We should revisit our earlier conversation," he said, meaning the financial exile they'd just imposed. I didn't let him continue. "Nothing's changed," I told him. "Except your perception." My voice was calm, but my spine was steel. My mother attempted damage control, layering her concern with artificial warmth. "Darling, we're so proud. Truly, we had no idea." But that was exactly the point. They hadn't cared enough to ask, hadn't cared enough to see. Their interest now wasn't love, it was leverage. And I wasn't about to be leveraged. James and Madison were worse. James tried to turn the conversation toward family synergy. Madison pushed her Fianki's campaign as the perfect place to feature Secure Health. I listened, letting them pitch me like an investor they'd just met at a cocktail party. But I wasn't buying it. Not this time. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't just a business win. It was a reclamation of power, of dignity, of voice. They had spent decades crafting the narrative of my inadequacy. And in a single moment, the truth had shattered that fiction. The earthquake had hit. The aftershocks were just beginning. Madison was the first to pivot fully into opportunism. "Cara, this is amazing. We've always known you were brilliant." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" I asked, voice cool. Because I remember being called free-spirited and directionless. She had the nerve to smile. "We meant creative." But the mask was cracking. My father shifted tactics too. "What you've built, it's impressive. Truly." He leaned in as if we were equals. "Let's talk investment strategy." I stared at him, silent. This was the same man who had laughed when I said I wanted to apply to MIT. The same man who called my work a hobby. Now I was a portfolio asset. James tried the soft sell approach. "Maybe I was wrong about tech," he admitted, probably for the first time in his adult life. "There's real opportunity here." I almost laughed. I didn't need him to believe in tech. I needed him to stop condescending to people who didn't wear a tie to work. He didn't understand the difference. My mother's approach was more personal. "I've always wanted to support you properly," she said, reaching for my hand. I pulled it back gently. "You supported the idea of me," I replied, "the version that fit your world." She looked wounded, but I didn't apologize. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself on the altar of her comfort. They weren't seeing me. They were seeing money, status, power, and trying to retroactively attach themselves to it. But that door had already closed. My life wasn't a family heirloom to be paraded when convenient. It was mine, and if they couldn't respect that, they couldn't claim it. The more they spoke, the clearer it became. They still didn't understand what had happened. They saw the number, the valuation, the buzzwords, but not the journey, not the nights coding in a sweat-soaked storage unit, not the rejections, the loans, the grit. They saw the summit, not the mountain. I stood then, glass still full, and looked each of them in the eye. "This isn't a moment I need you for," I said softly. "It's one I've already earned." Aunt Patricia beamed. Everyone else looked unsure whether to applaud or retreat. That tension? It was the cost of clarity, the price of shedding illusion. My father tried one last strategy. "Family means adjusting as we learn more," he offered. "Now that we understand your success." But I shook my head. "I didn't change tonight," I said. "You did. And that shift, that's what you have to sit with." The truth stung. But I wasn't cushioning it anymore. The invitations flowed quickly after that. To dinner, to clubs, to share my insights. But I declined each one, not out of spite but to protect what I had built. My peace, my integrity, my team. This family had ignored me when I was building. They didn't get to celebrate the tower now that it stood. I left early, taking Aunt Patricia with me. As we drove back to Cambridge, neither of us said much at first. But the silence wasn't heavy, it was clean. I'd drawn a line, not with anger, but with finality. And on the other side of that line, for the first time in years, I could finally breathe. Back at my loft, the city glittered like a quiet witness. I stood by the window, wine in hand, watching Boston breathe beneath me. The evening had unspooled every hidden tension I'd held inside for years, but strangely, I didn't feel exhausted. I felt clear. The fog of needing their approval had finally lifted. Secure health was no longer my secret triumph. It was public, and it was powerful. But more than that, it had survived without them. And now, with that truth exposed, I could fully own it. Not as a rebellion, not as a plea for recognition, but as the outcome of vision, persistence, and purpose. My inbox was exploding with congratulations from real allies, investors, mentors, fellow founders, people who had seen the spark before it became a blaze, people who chose to believe before the headlines did. I responded with humility and gratitude, not because I needed their praise but because they mattered. The contrast between those emails and my family's sudden attention was stark. The former felt earned, the latter felt like opportunism disguised as affection. And I realized, love isn't real if it only shows up when you're useful. Support isn't support if it's conditional on success. So I wrote down a new rule: protect the source of peace. And for me, that meant distance, not exile but clarity. Boundaries. I would no longer confuse proximity with loyalty. From now on, the people who stood close would be the ones who showed up when things were hard, not just when things were impressive. Over the next few days, the media storm intensified. Forbes confirmed the cover. The Financial Times requested an exclusive. CNBC booked me for a segment. But through it all, I stayed grounded. I knew the real story wasn't the valuation, it was the vindication. Not from my family, but from myself. Alicia coordinated everything masterfully, ensuring I had space between each spotlight. Our office buzzed with energy, champagne bottles, spontaneous applause, a cake shaped like our logo. But the celebration wasn't about ego. It was about mission. Every person in that building had helped change healthcare. I gave interviews that centered our users, the patients, the doctors, the hospitals transforming because of what we'd built. I refused to make it about my family. I wouldn't give them a starring role in a journey they'd refuse to walk with me. My story didn't need their shadow to shine. When the Wall Street Journal asked about early family support, I paused. Let's just say the people who mattered were the ones who believed before belief was easy. That was the truth. Polite, but unmistakable. And in that moment, I felt something deeper than pride. I felt freedom. We don't just get to rewrite the story. We get to choose who makes it into the pages. And for the first time, I wasn't writing to prove anything. I was writing because I'd earned the pen, and the only voice I needed to hear now was mine. 6 months later, Secure Health had doubled in size. Our platform was now used by over 400 hospitals. Wait times had dropped drastically. Lives were being improved, sometimes even saved. But the number I cared most about wasn't revenue. It was impact. And that number was growing every single day. My biological family stayed at arm's length. I didn't block them, but I didn't bend either. Invitations were acknowledged but rarely accepted. Calls were returned after thoughtful delay. I maintained respect but no longer obligation. And that made all the difference. I was no longer a Mitchell shadow, I was Cara Mitchell, fully defined. Aunt Patricia became more involved in my world. She joined the foundation we launched to support women in healthcare technology. Her name carried weight, but her presence carried wisdom. She understood, as few did, what it meant to walk away from inherited definitions of success. She had done it decades earlier. I was continuing that legacy. My chosen family colleagues, investors, fellow builders became my inner circle. They didn't care where I'd gone to school or who my parents were. They cared about what I built, about why I built it. And that connection wasn't just professional. It was personal. It was real. In the end, my family had cut me off hoping it would humble me. Instead, it freed me to build without fear, to lead without apology, and to finally see that the family I needed, the one that mattered, was the one I chose to build, brick by honest brick. The family dynamic had shifted, though no one dared say it aloud. Where once I was treated like the wandering experiment, now I was carefully regarded. Every text from my father came dressed in politeness, every message from Madison framed as collaboration. But beneath their new tone lived the same motive: control. They hadn't changed, not really. What changed was the perceived value of what I now represented. Suddenly, my tech knowledge, my computer stuff, wasn't a liability, it was a potential leverage point for their campaigns, their investments, their social image. I wasn't the failure anymore. I was the asset. It was strange watching them struggle to recalibrate. They didn't know how to handle someone they had previously dismissed who now held undeniable power. They weren't used to needing me. Their charm, once aimed downward, now tried to reach sideways. But I saw through it and stayed 10 steps ahead. Aunt Patricia warned me early on. They'll rebrand their behavior if it serves them, and she was right. What they'd ridiculed as foolish ambition was now being reframed as a misunderstood success story. I smiled politely when they spoke this way, but I didn't forget how quickly they had tried to erase me. So I held the boundary. Family was not a business partner. The lines were now permanent. If they wanted connection, it had to be real, not rooted in valuation or headlines but in respect. Until then, we could coexist on the surface, but my heart stayed guarded. My future no longer needed their approval, only integrity. Weeks after the IPO, Madison extended a formal invitation, a fundraising dinner for Brian's campaign. She framed it as casual, of course, just a small circle of political allies. It would mean a lot to us, but I could feel the weight behind her words. This wasn't a request, it was a move. The implication was clear. They wanted to showcase me, a newly minted tech CEO, the sister with the $100 million company, their newest political accessory, a way to strengthen Brian's platform with innovation and female leadership. They didn't ask what I wanted. They asked for what looked good. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I forwarded the invite to Alicia, who flagged it with her usual bluntness. Only attend if you're willing to be commodified. Her words cut straight to the point. I had spent years fighting to be seen as more than optics. I wasn't about to play prop now. Eventually, I replied with civility. Thank you for the invitation. I'll consider it if the event includes discussion on healthcare equity and ethical tech. The silence that followed spoke volumes. My presence was wanted, but my voice was still too inconvenient. They wanted the face, not the mission. I didn't go, and they noticed. But I didn't owe anyone justification. Not anymore. I had earned the right to protect my values. And if that meant disappointing family once again, so be it. I'd rather be true than tolerated. That dinner wasn't mine to attend. It was theirs to learn from. James showed up at my office without notice. My assistant warned me, but I agreed to 5 minutes. He walked in with his usual polished Rolex glinting, tailored suit crisp, but something in his eyes had shifted. Not smugness this time, hesitation, a man calculating the odds. He came with a proposal, a Mitchell Ventures partnership, a new arm of the family office that would invest in minority-led tech companies with me as the face. "You'd be the perfect symbol," he said, not realizing how telling that phrase was. I wasn't a leader. I was a symbol, a strategy. I listened, curious. He laid out projections, partnerships, family-backed capital. He even mentioned political connections that could fast-track government contracts. It was polished, smart, and completely disconnected from the reasons I built Secure Health in the first place. It wasn't about mission. It was about optics. When he finished, I thanked him. Then I said no, not cruelly, not defensively, just clearly. I told him Secure Health didn't need another name on the masthead. It didn't need validation by proximity. I had worked too hard for too long to dilute my purpose in exchange for old money and borrowed prestige. James tried to hide his reaction, but I saw the flicker of insult. He wasn't used to hearing no from family, especially not from me. "If you ever change your mind," he said as he stood. "I won't," I replied simply, and for the first time, I think he actually believed me. It was during a meeting with my PR team that the shift became undeniable. We were discussing the upcoming speaking circuit, major conferences, televised panels, even an invite from MIT. I looked at the list and realized something strange. None of it required family. Not one opportunity had come from a Mitchell. Every door had opened because of merit, vision, and persistence. Because of Alicia's tireless strategy. Because of the engineers who trusted my leadership. Because of investors like Jessica Barnes who didn't ask if I had a husband, only if I had a roadmap. It was both humbling and liberating. That night, I walked alone by the harbor and let it sink in. I had outgrown the story they tried to write for me. I wasn't the failed Mitchell child anymore. I was something else entirely. A woman who had defined success on her own terms, even when no one believed she could. And that realization changed everything. I stopped needing their applause. I stopped editing myself at holidays. I no longer feared being misunderstood because I was finally understood where it mattered. In my company, in my mission, in the mirror. It wasn't vengeance. It was freedom. Freedom from the emotional debt I'd been paying since childhood. I no longer owed them proof. I owed myself peace. And from that place, I began to truly thrive, not in reaction to their neglect, but in pursuit of something greater than validation. They didn't stop trying. My mother invited me to charity events under the pretense of visibility. James forwarded insider deals. Madison sent a pitch deck from Brian, asking for a few minutes of your expertise. I responded to none of it. Silence became my new strategy, not out of pettiness but out of clarity. I had nothing to gain from re-entering a game I never agreed to play. Their currency was still status and access. Mine was impact, and there was no conversion rate between the two. No way to make their table feel like home. Alicia supported me through it all. Every ignored email, every unanswered RSVP. "You're not obligated to respond to people who only learned your name after your net worth." She kept me grounded. Reminded me that boundaries weren't rudeness, they were respect for my own growth. And when media questions came, "What does your family think of your success?" I answered honestly but briefly. "We come from different frameworks of success." That was enough. I didn't need to air wounds. My story spoke loudest through action. Through hospitals helped. Through lives changed. Somehow silence became my loudest declaration. A refusal to be manipulated by affection that only showed up when I became useful. I chose to build in peace. Let my name speak for itself, and let them wonder what else I might be building next without ever asking. The moment that sealed everything came at a Boston Tech Awards gala. I was being honored for Healthcare Innovation of the Year, and as I took the stage, I saw them, my parents, seated at the back, flanked by political donors and old family friends. They hadn't told me they were coming. It was a public gesture, no doubt calculated. They wanted to be seen supporting me now, to realign with success in a way that made them appear enlightened. I could have been angry, but I wasn't. I was done expecting emotional currency from people who traded in appearances. Instead, I gave my speech about coding in the dark as a teenager, about being told I was wasting my potential, about how real innovation doesn't come from comfort, but from rejection. The crowd clapped. I locked eyes with my father for a moment. He looked uncertain. After the ceremony, They approached me. "We're proud of you," my mother said, clutching a designer clutch like a shield. "You've accomplished something truly extraordinary." I nodded. "Thank you." That was it. No emotional excavation. No overdue apologies. Just acknowledgement on my stage. Later that night, I rewrote my bio. No more black sheep narrative. No more caveats. Just the truth. Founder and CEO of Secure Health. Builder, leader, innovator. No asterisk. No exceptions. Just Cara Mitchell. On her own terms. After the IPO, congratulations flooded in from across industries. Venture capitalists, tech founders, even former professors reached out with pride. But one message stood out, a handwritten note from a teenager I'd met during a school talk. She wrote, "I didn't know girls like us could do things like this." That sentence hit harder than any headline. Girls like us, girls overlooked, underestimated, uninvited to the table. I had spent years trying to earn a seat at the wrong table, only to realize I could build one myself. That note reminded me who I was doing this for. Not for press or prestige, but for impact. So I leaned into that mission. I launched the Secure Health Fellowship Program, grants for high school girls interested in STEM. We partnered with coding boot camps and mentorship groups. For every dollar we made, we planted a seed somewhere new. I wanted to multiply opportunity, not just accumulate accolades. And it wasn't just about young women. We piloted versions of Secure Health for rural clinics, correctional facilities, and native reservations. If we had the technology to connect people to care, there was no excuse not to use it widely. Success without inclusion wasn't success at all, it was vanity. Every morning, I walked into our office reminded of our purpose, not by stock prices, but by the stories that line the walls, patient letters, partner testimonials, impact dashboards. I'd redefined legacy not as inheritance, but as access. My family's approval became irrelevant. This was the legacy I chose. There was a strange peace that came after I stopped trying to impress them. My family, I mean. I realized I had internalized their voices, always asking if it was enough. The right degree, the right salary, the right man. It was exhausting carrying their checklist in my head for years. But one morning, sitting in my office overlooking the harbor, I saw that the checklist was gone. I wasn't comparing anymore. I didn't need their metrics. My own metrics made more sense. Does this help people? Does this excite me? Does this reflect who I really am? The freedom was electric. I stopped showing up to dinners out of guilt. I stopped explaining myself at events. And I stopped measuring my success by who clapped. Because the right people had clapped before the IPO. They had stood beside me in a co-working closet, sweating through heat waves and hoping against odds. It wasn't rejection that freed me, it was release. The moment I released the need for them to get it, I got myself fully. I stopped chasing closure and started building clarity. And that clarity echoed through everything. My leadership, my communication, my relationships. It was no longer about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right. That I had been right to trust my gut, right to stay curious, right to keep going when they said stop. And now, I wasn't just free, I was powerful. And they knew it, even if they'd never say so out loud. Boundaries used to scare me. I thought they were walls, barriers that shut people out. But I've since learned they're doors with locks. You choose who comes in. And you don't owe anyone entry just because they share your last name, especially if they've only ever knocked to take something. The first boundary I drew was financial. No family investments, no partnerships, no advisory roles. I wasn't going to let their old power games invade what I had built on my own terms. The second boundary was emotional. I would no longer seek approval where none was sincerely offered. It was hard at first. The guilt crept in, the second guessing. What if I was being too harsh? What if I was repeating the coldness they'd shown me? But Alicia reminded me, boundaries aren't cruelty, they're clarity. And clarity is a gift, to yourself and to everyone else. So I stopped answering passive-aggressive texts. I deleted manipulative voicemails. I arved no to events that once felt obligatory. And in that space, something amazing happened. I found energy I didn't know I had. Focus, creativity, peace. Because I wasn't constantly bracing for emotional landmines. And the most unexpected part, they adjusted. Not all at once, and not perfectly, but they began to treat me differently. Not because I demanded respect, but because I stopped accepting less. That's what boundaries do. They teach people how to treat you. and they teach you how to thrive. It took me years to understand that family isn't always defined by blood. Home isn't the place you came from, it's where you're truly seen. For me, that place became the glass-walled office in Kendall Square. The people who stayed late, fought for vision, celebrated every little win. That was home. Alicia, my right hand. The dev team that brainstormed around whiteboards and pizza boxes. The interns who stayed past midnight because they believed in the mission. These people didn't care about my last name. They cared about the work. They made me feel more accepted than any Mitchell dinner ever had. So I leaned into this chosen family. I hosted team retreats instead of holiday galas, sent flowers to employee parents instead of networking gifts. We built traditions, impact reports over champagne, morning huddles with playlists, cake for every hospital milestone. It wasn't polished, but it was real. When a junior engineer's mother got sick, we rallied around her like family would. When Alicia lost her apartment in a flood, 3 of us offered her our couches before she could ask. We didn't have ancestral portraits or legacy funds, we had loyalty, empathy, and belief in one another. That's when I knew I hadn't just escaped the limitations of my family name, I had created something better. Something that didn't demand perfection, but encouraged authenticity. Not just a business, but a community. Not just a platform, but a purpose. This was the family I'd been searching for all along. With success came visibility, and with visibility came scrutiny. People started writing about my clothes, my relationship status, even how I spoke. Reporters asked about the feud with my family as if it were entertainment. Old classmates surfaced with half-true memories. The spotlight didn't always feel warm. At first, I tried to manage it all, polish every response, curate every angle. But I quickly realized that authenticity mattered more than optics. If I wanted to inspire the next generation of women in tech, I had to show all of it. Not just the wins, but the scars. The struggle was part of the story. So I told the truth. In interviews, I talked about building while broke, crying in bathrooms, facing rejection after rejection. I shared how imposter syndrome still whispered in my ear. I told them that even billion-dollar dreams begin with shaky confidence and stubborn hope. The vulnerability didn't weaken my message, it made it land harder. Women messaged me from India, Nigeria, and Detroit saying they saw themselves in me, that they'd almost given up until they saw me stand firm in rooms where I once felt invisible. My story gave them fuel. Their messages gave me purpose. Of course, not everyone understood. Some critics called me ungrateful. Others accused me of exaggeration. But that's the price of being visible as a woman who doesn't play by the old rules. I wasn't here to be palatable. I was here to be powerful and to make room for others to be too. One quiet Sunday, I met Aunt Patricia for tea in her tiny Cambridge apartment. She looked over my new foundation's annual report, nodding with quiet pride. "You know," she said, "you've reclaimed the Mitchell name without their permission and transformed what it stands for." She was right. I no longer flinched when people asked about my family. I told the truth. I love them, but I don't need them to love what I do. I respect them, but I don't shape my choices around their expectations. And strangely, that honesty brought a new kind of peace. Over time, our dynamic softened. My father still talked about markets instead of emotions, but his tone carried respect. My mother still invited me to benefits, but now she asked, not demanded. Madison stopped trying to leverage my success and started asking about purpose. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was real. I set the terms. No access to my company, no leveraging my name, just relationship, if they wanted it. And if they didn't, I was okay with that too. The difference now was that I no longer craved their approval, I chose whether to engage, when and how. And with that, I redefined family not by proximity, but by reciprocity. The people I call mine now are those who celebrate me before the headlines, who challenge me with love, and who walk with me whether I rise or fall. The Mitchell legacy may have dismissed me, but I've created one of my own. When I finally stopped hiding my story, something shifted, not just in how others saw me, but in how I saw myself. For years, I'd let shame and self-preservation dictate what I shared, but silence had cost me visibility, and visibility is power. The moment I stepped forward, fully and without apology, I became unstoppable. I began speaking at conferences not just as a CEO, but as a woman who had been underestimated. My keynotes weren't just about secure health, they were about resilience, exclusion, and reclaiming the space you were never invited into. I told the story of being cut off, not for sympathy, but for perspective. To my surprise, audiences leaned in. Executives who had dismissed me months prior were suddenly quoting my words. Young founders sent emails saying they'd finally pitched their idea after hearing me. Teachers invited me to speak to their students. I had become a voice, not because I was the loudest, but because I was the realest. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father once said my voice held no strategic value in business meetings. Now, it filled auditoriums. The narrative I once buried out of fear became the thing that made me unforgettable. Authenticity wasn't a liability, it was my leverage. Owning my narrative meant no longer begging for seats at old tables. It meant building new ones. I wasn't trying to fit in anymore, I was defining what it meant to belong. And every time I told my story, someone else realized they could own theirs too. The Mitchell Innovation Foundation started as a gesture, a way to give back, but it quickly became something far greater, a mechanism for transformation. We weren't just writing checks. We were creating access, mentorship, and belief in girls who'd been told their dreams were unrealistic. Our first scholarship recipient was a 16-year-old from Roxbury who wanted to become a biomedical engineer. When we surprised her at her high school, she cried in her mother's arms. "I didn't think people like me got chances like this," she said. That sentence stayed with me for weeks. We launched workshops, mentorship programs, startup grants, women-led healthcare ventures that would have never made it past a male VC gatekeeper suddenly had support. We funded projects in wearable tech for chronic illness, apps for maternal health, and platforms addressing racial disparities in diagnosis. Each initiative was a quiet rebellion against the systems that told girls like me to stay small. We weren't just lifting individuals, we were shifting ecosystems. Every line of code, every prototype, every pitch deck funded by the foundation carried a piece of my journey inside it. This wasn't charity, it was legacy work. And it was proof that success means nothing unless it opens doors for someone else. I didn't want to be the exception. I wanted to be the blueprint. Perhaps the greatest gift of success is the ability to say no without fear. No to toxic dynamics. No to exploitation masked as opportunity. No to being anyone's second choice or backup plan. For the first time in my life, I wasn't surviving. I was choosing. When my father offered to advise the foundation, I declined, politely but firmly. When Madison tried to loop me into a panel for Brian's campaign, I declined again. No press release, no grand confrontation, just a boundary, the kind I never knew I was allowed to have before. I stopped explaining myself, stopped over-justifying decisions. If someone couldn't respect my no, they didn't deserve access to my yes. That clarity rippled into every part of my life. From partnerships to friendships, I made space only for what aligned with who I was becoming. This wasn't bitterness. It was discernment. I still had love for my family, but I no longer allowed them to dictate the terms of my worth. I loved them best from a distance. The version of me that needed to prove something had done her job and she could finally rest. And in that space, I found a new kind of luxury. Not the luxury of material wealth, but the luxury of alignment, of walking into rooms fully myself, of saying yes only to what was built on truth. I never built Secure Health for the accolades, but they came anyway. Forbes listed me as one of the women reshaping healthcare. MIT invited me to keynote their tech summit. Invitations from organizations that once overlooked me now filled my inbox weekly. But the ones that mattered most were the ones I used to dream about. When Harvard's Women in Business Club reached out, I hesitated. The same institution my family once worshipped, where I was deemed not Mitchell enough, now wanted to hear my story. I accepted but rewrote the terms. I wouldn't speak about entrepreneurship. I'd speak about erasure, resilience, and power. Standing on that stage, in front of young women wearing the same pressure I used to carry, I didn't tell them how to succeed. I told them how to survive until they remembered they already could. My presence on that stage wasn't about prestige. It was about reclamation, and the applause didn't matter nearly as much as the quiet, tearful thank yous after. One student hugged me and whispered, "I thought I had to become someone else to make it. You reminded me I don't." That's what recognition means when it's rooted in truth, not just being seen, but seen for who you really are. I returned to my hotel that night without checking headlines. I didn't need validation from a newspaper. I had already given it to myself, and more importantly, passed it on. When people spoke about the Mitchell legacy now, it wasn't just about old money or political marriages. It was about innovation, access, and transformation. That shift didn't come because I asked permission. It came because I stopped waiting for approval and started building anyway. Secure Health's logo was now etched into hospital wings. The foundation's scholarships bore my name. And little by little, even my family had to rewrite the narrative. They could no longer ignore the daughter they once tried to silence. My success was no longer a detour, it was the main road. But legacy wasn't just what I left behind. It was how I lived every day. It was in the faces of interns I mentored, in the emails from patients who finally saw specialists because of our platform, in the firm, unshaken voice I used at every board meeting when someone tried to minimize my vision. It wasn't lost on me that my grandfather, once the pride of the Mitchell line, had his portrait hanging in the family dining room. Now, my story lived in headlines, policy panels, and most importantly, in impact. I wasn't just a chapter in the Mitchell family story. I was writing a new volume altogether. And this version didn't require inherited wealth or elite approval. It required conviction, purpose, and a refusal to shrink. That was the legacy I'd pass on, one defined by truth, not tradition. A year after our IPO, Secure Health hosted its first national summit. Healthcare leaders, tech innovators, and policymakers gathered in Boston to discuss digital equity. I stood on stage as the keynote speaker just blocks from my childhood home and looked out at a room filled with people who finally saw me. My parents were in the audience. They came quietly, without demands, without expectations. They sat beside Aunt Patricia, who held both their hands when I started speaking. I didn't acknowledge them directly in my speech, but they heard every word I said. I talked about being underestimated, about building in the dark, about how the world doesn't always reward truth but it needs it. And when I said, success isn't about being accepted, it's about being undeniable, my father lowered his eyes, and my mother wiped a tear. Afterward, my father approached me with something I never expected, not advice, not apology, but a simple, sincere thank you. You've done something remarkable, Cara, he said, and I hope one day I understand how. That moment wasn't closure, but it was connection, and that was enough. Coming full circle didn't mean returning to who I was. It meant arriving as who I had become, not the family disappointment, not the underestimated daughter, but the builder, the leader, the CEO of my own story. If you've ever sat at a table where your voice was ignored, you're not alone. If you've ever been told your path was a dead end, or your dream too risky, know this, your vision is valid. You don't need approval to build something extraordinary. You don't need a legacy to create your own. My journey taught me that success isn't something handed down, it's something you carve out of rejection, doubt, and belief. It's built in the quiet hours, the solo battles, and the uncelebrated breakthroughs. And when it finally comes, it doesn't just change your life, it changes the room you walk into. So if your family dismissed your dream, keep building. If they called your work a hobby, double down. Because when you stop trying to fit someone else's mold, you'll finally see the strength in your own design. The greatest form of revenge isn't anger, it's becoming undeniable. I'd love to hear your story. Has your family ever tried to clip your wings before you could fly? What did you do when no one believed in you? Drop it in the comments, I read every single one. And if you're still in the dark, still doubting, let this be your sign to keep going. If this story moved you, hit the like button, it helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next moment where power shifts and the underestimated rise. And if you feel generous, hit that super thanks, it supports more storytelling like this. Remember, you don't need their permission, you just need your purpose. Keep building your legacy on your own terms.